Okay, thanks very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me speak to you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I just want to start by thanking you for all your bravery and hard work over the previous months. You've been inspiring people around XR around the world and lots of other people. So I very much appreciate your efforts and feel quite humbled, as I usually do, when I get to speak to people. I just want to go through a few sort of initial things in case it's not obvious. I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not formally speaking on behalf of any Extinction Rebellion group. That's what I always do. So that's the situation on that. I obviously want to apologise for being characteristically English and not knowing any foreign languages, which is a national failing. I'm a classic example of that. So sorry, my Polish isn't quite up to scratch. I also want to apologise or acknowledge before I start any incoherence in my arguments that I want to present to you. It's a great responsibility to be talking about this subject because of the extreme seriousness of the situation we're in. And I see myself very much in a dialogical relationship, in dialogue with other intellectuals and influencers around the world on exactly how we are going to navigate the next 20 or 30 years. And as you may know, most of the time I spend talking to people and researching more sort of mundane subjects of how to get, people into meetings and out of meetings feeling empowered. So it feels a little bit abstract to be talking about such a big subject as revolution in the 21st century. However, I do passionately believe that if we're going to be successful in our efforts over the next 5 to 10 years, we have to have a really clear idea of why radical movements have failed in the past and how they're going to succeed in the future. And that requires like a strategic overview of what needs to be done and how. And it also requires a sort of larger sense of you influencing history, right? This isn't a consumer, emailing campaign by a Vaz, right? This is it. It's the real world, and it's going to come and bite us in many ways, as we're already realizing. So there is, in a sense, nothing more serious than the topic I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a quote by the British philosopher John Locke, who's English Civil War philosopher in the 17th century. And he, for his sins, had a number of things to say about subjects around that period in history. And the quote that I'm going to quote was on the beginning of the Declaration of Rebellion against the British government in October 2018. And the quote, I think, has a transcultural, ahistorical resonance, as you might say. And it goes as follows, which is to love truth for truth's sake is the principal part of perfection in this world and the seed plot of all other virtues. And there's an important reason why this was the founding quote of Extinction Rebellion, which was the proposition that only by staying within the truth can you remain virtuous. And on a social level, that means if a society engages in a self-evident lie, then that society will become unvirtuous and decay and collapse. And we know this, of course, not least in Eastern Europe in the period up to 1989, when society lived an enormous lie. And my proposition, I suppose, is that societies now are also living a massive lie. And that lie is that things can carry on the way they are without creating ecological and social collapse. So that's the reality that we find ourselves in, is this massive lie that we are facing. So to ground that, I suppose, in some reality, the first sense of that lie is the COVID crisis that everyone's facing around the world, that all of a sudden, within 3 or 4 weeks, the global economy was closed down because of a microscopic virus which invades the human body. And the reason for that, as we know, is because of the extreme pressures on the natural world from human intrusion and extraction. So what we know is that COVID is the first step towards this ecological, economic and social collapse. And at a recent conference 2 weeks ago, it was confirmed that we're now at 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and we'll be heading over 1.5 degrees in the next 5 to 10 years. And due to the Arctic melting at some point in the 2030s, and due to global dimming, that is pollution in the atmosphere, being reduced, then we're looking at going over 2 degrees centigrade in the early 2030s, certainly before 2040. So that really is the massive game changer that my sort of discussion is going to be based on. In other words, like as we hit 2 degrees centigrade, a recent peer-reviewed paper suggested that there'll be 1,000 million refugees on the go. So this is the pivot, I suppose, between the pivot from traditional one issue environmentalism, talking about penguins and ice and glaciers and such like. And it's the pivot towards actually what climate change means. What climate change means is economic collapse due to the mass forced migration of hundreds of millions of people over the next 10 to 20 years. So the first experience of climate collapse will be COVID-like events. In other words, economic depression, the loss of opportunities, the loss of welfare services, social stress. And then that follows on to social collapse, which is in its full horror, mass rape, slaughter, and starvation. That's the reality that Extinction Rebellion has given itself the job to communicate to the world, that this is no longer an environmental question, it's primarily a question of political corruption. In other words, our focus going forward as a new revolutionary movement that we need to be is to focus on the state and the political class that controls the state and the desire of that political class to send the next generation into hell because it's unable or unwilling to challenge the corporate global regime. So that sort of is the introduction to why we're talking about revolution this evening. What everyone agrees with at this stage in history is there needs to be a massive economic transformation. There's nothing radical about that observation, right? There's been a report out by the Bank of England in the UK saying so, and Bill Gates, if you've read the article, has already just published a book saying exactly the same thing. The reason why the Bank of England and Bill Gates are historically and politically illiterate is because they don't understand that the only way, sociologically speaking, you can bring about massive economic change in a short period of time is through mass political disruption. In other words, a political revolution. So that's why we have to engage in a realist sense on what this revolution is going to look like, because this revolution is inevitable at this stage of history because the social collapse is now locked in. So the question is, do we have a progressive, radical, democratic revolution, or do we, by various stages and collapses, return to their days of fascism and authoritarianism? That's the key question for our generation, and particularly for the younger generation at this point. In other words, it's like an intensely political question. We're not in the days of surface reformist environmentalism anymore because of the absolute extremity of what we face. So I want to say a little bit technically about what I mean by a revolution. So I've got a technical and precise definition of what it means. I don't want to give the impression tonight that I'm talking about some vague utopian, like airy-fairy idea. A political revolution is a sociological category. It means that you're removing not just the government, but the political regime, but you're maintaining the existence of the state. Those are all different things. Okay, so we're taking away the regime, the neoliberal regime, which stands behind all the corrupted representational democracy parties. Okay, this is juxtaposed to the notion of reformism when you have an issue and you influence a policy of a government. They're very different things. Okay, so the question that I want to consider for the rest of my talk is, how do you construct this revolution given that the objective conditions of revolution are rapidly approaching and arguably present in Poland at the present time? So what I want to suggest is that Poland, this is the bit where it gets a bit stressful for you, but I would like to suggest that Poland is in a particular political sweet spot, in the sense that it's possible to have a successful revolution in Poland and similar countries. And I want to explain why that's potentially the case. So I think the first reason is because Poland, as I understand it, has a very recent understanding of what authoritarianism looks like, not least because of the experience before 1989. And of course, the spectre of authoritarianism is very present at the present moment, right? Now, that's very different to Western societies like in the UK or Canada or Australia, who have a certain complacency about their liberties and their freedoms. And that leads to a very difficult job in actually creating mobilization. While potentially in Eastern Europe and Poland, there's a greater seriousness and realism about what social evil looks like. And the other aspect that puts Poland in the spotlight, I suppose, is that unlike very authoritarian or repressed societies, there's still a degree of education and liberty that provides the potentiality to organize effectively and overcome a regime. In other words, you have that sweet spot combination. It's not super repressed, but it's not super complacent. So what I'm interested in doing, of course, is talking to you guys and putting forward what I see as some of the main elements of what a successful revolution would look like. And I want to acknowledge at this point that that I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants here, in so much as a lot of what I'm saying has been put forward by other scholars and intellectuals. I think what I'm hoping to do tonight is to bring together the various elements in so much as they can become synergistic and enable a success to happen. The other thing I just want to say is that I think this discussion is extremely important, and it's extremely important that we consider, like, in an open way, the various potentialities and possibilities. And we do that in a way that is not repressive. In other words, we need to have an open debate on the left where people can speak their minds and say things that are potentially unacceptable about the failures of the left without being cancelled. And obviously, as you may know, that's one of the problems that I've been subjected to, because I like to say what I think. So I'm going to sort of be fairly critical, not because I'm trying to be unpleasant or show lack of solidarity, but because we have to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves, like John Locke says, in order to be successful. Okay, so I'm going to run through 4 or 5 key elements that I think are essential in a 21st century revolution. I'm going to run through them fairly quickly because in a short 45-minute talk, I can't really go into great detail. So you might want to ask me about some in more detail. But hopefully it's going to give you a flavor of the very different direction revolution has to take in the 21st century to avoid the mistakes of the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, so the first point I want to make is really foundational, which is why I'm saying it first, which is any revolutionary movement that's going to be successful in a progressive sense has to have non-violence at the core of its philosophy of action. That has to be absolutely essential, and there can't be compromise on it. There's an extensive literature that shows that if violence enters into a movement in any substantial way, then it degenerates the movement and degrades the movement into a macho and authoritarian and closed culture. That in itself, of course, is politically problematic and unethical. But a more important point here is that any successful revolution that's going to be progressive has to encourage mass participation. Mass participation fundamentally means the engagement of the old people, young people, and women. And any violent revolution usually degrades into a young man's routine, okay? And it's basically a numbers game, as you're probably aware from the research from Erica Chenoweth and similar scholars, that what you need to do is create a low entry cost. In other words, it's easy to go onto the street. It's not easy to join a terrorist cell or a guerrilla movement. And this is the primary non-moral reason why violent revolutions are generally unsuccessful. And we should also consider, of course, that in so much as they are successful, historically 95% of them lead to civil war, authoritarianism, or social collapse within 5 years. In other words, you win, but you lose. So that's something that we really need to close the book on as we move forward. The second key element of revolution in 21st century is mass mobilization, which is one of the things that I work on. What mass mobilization basically means is it's a modern word for the classical sort of revolutionary strategy, which was called go to the people. So go to the people was used by Russian revolutionaries in the 19th century or revolutionaries after 1968 in the Third World. What it means is to get out of your bubble of comfortable middle-class intellectual urban life and go out into the regions, into the towns, into the countryside and speak with ordinary people. And the fundamental element of successful progressive revolution is not to go to the people with a top-down, authoritarian, dogmatic ideology in the classical sort of vulgar Marxist tradition. The psychology of mass mobilization is fundamentally based upon the notion of people engaging in the act of speech. In other words, encouraging people to speak, not talking to people. And there's this particular format of doing that, which in the UK and maybe in other countries is called people's assemblies, where people come together. And the primary purpose of the episode is to enable people to listen to each other. And through people listening to each other, they naturally radicalize rather than being told to radicalize by some self-important urban intellectuals. Okay, so this is a fundamental break from the authoritarian, like revolutionary tradition. And this has been shown to work over and over again in supporting the first point, which is mass participation, civil disobedience. People need to own their movement in order to engage in civil disobedience. And they do that by being allowed to speak and creating their own sort of radical reality, as it were. So the third point, which is sort of related to it, is this notion of beyond politics, which is one of the slogans of Extinction Rebellion. And I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion has been so successful around the world is not so much because of its proposal to engage in civil disobedience, but because of its reconfiguration of what we mean by politics itself. So one of the disasters of the left over the last 30 years and even longer has been the reduction of politics into some analysis of power and inequality. Important as that analysis is, that's not primarily what motivates many people to engage in resistance. What enables people to engage in mass civil disobedience and social movements is primarily sociability. By sociability, I mean the non-political like culture of a group that's supporting, welcoming, fun, cultural, and humanizing. And this is something the left never gets because it has a sort of enlightenment dogma that you convince people through hard political ideas. You don't. It's sociologically and psychologically illiterate due to modern research. Most people will join Extinction Rebellion in Poland because it's cool, right? They like the people in it. They feel loved by the people in it. the people are welcoming, they don't give people a shitty time, right? So this is essential. And also, of course, it's intrinsically progressive because the reductive political culture of the left over the last century has led to the authoritarianism that we've seen in many countries, not least Poland. Okay, so that leads on to the next point, which is about coalition building. So there's a lot of misunderstandings about coalition building in the sense of movement of movements. So the idea, the traditional idea, is that elite actors, elite political actors in big cities go and coalition build with other elite actors in big cities. In other words, you get together all the elites, the counter elites, and they engage in some sort of social confrontation. There's a big reason why that doesn't work, because most of the left and progressive political elites have no interest in revolution, right? They're primarily interested in gatekeeping and maintaining their reformist agendas, not least because they're already in positions of power. So the strategy for coalition building has to be to talk to the individuals in those demographics and groups, not the leaders of them. So for instance, going to talk to trade union branches, not talking to trade union leaders, right? That's the revolutionary sort of tradition. And what's very important, and this is a massive challenge to the closed culture of left-wing groups, is you have to start talking, or rather listening, to groups that you traditionally don't like, because those groups are going to enable you to create the mass movement. You're not going to create the mass movement by students from a few elite universities around the cities of Poland or any other country. You're going to do it by talking to the far larger demographics in the country. And some of those demographics in terms of revolutionary history determine the success of a revolution. In other words, there's certain groups that start off conservative, but in revolutionary periods move to the left. And they move to the left because they're invited in by a welcoming culture of the revolutionary movement. So 3 groups that spring to mind are farmers. Farmers, as we should know, like myself, have been fucked over by the neoliberal system for 30 years. And the only reason they're not moving to the left, as I see it, is because of the cultural blocks imposed on them by the cultural elites of the big cities. If you speak to them or enable them to speak, they're perfectly capable of moving in a radical direction, not least because they're going to lose their livelihoods over the next 10 to 20 years. The second group is small business people in the cities who have, again, been destroyed by neoliberalism and the unfairness of corporate capitalism. And again, these are hardworking people. They're not oppressors. They're people that are part of the coalition. And the third group, which might sound problematic in Poland, but I still want to tell it to you, is the church. The church usually, as we all know, is a bastion of conservatism. However, historically, at periods of social injustice, significant proportions of the church, not least the lay people in the church, are capable of making an alliance with the radical elements in society. You saw this, for instance, in the revolution against Marcos in the Philippines in 1984, where when the Catholic Church came over to the revolutionary movement, then the regime collapsed in a matter of weeks. So there's a big challenge there. And again, the key element to it is to go and listen to the groups, don't go and argue with them, right? Because through that listening, you'll get some respect, mutual respect, and you can grow. And another little add-on here, which is a broader point about getting ordinary people into the movement, is one of the biggest disasters of radical middle-class movements in the Western world has been the inability to talk everyday language. Everyday language is an essential element in the mobilization effort. Like professional university language is the language of oppression for the majority of the population. That's how they perceive it. So as soon as you go and talk all the long words that get you good marks in university essays, you immediately alienate ordinary people. And so you need to learn how to speak in ordinary language, or more importantly, recruit people from ordinary demographics to talk to ordinary people. She had farmers talking to farmers, Catholics talking to Catholics, small business people talking to small business people. That's how you grow a movement to the extent that is necessary. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the fifth thing, which is a more political point and quite a big break from the revolutions over the last 100 years. Broadly speaking, we can see revolutions over this period breaking into two groups. So there's the traditional sort of hard left Marxist sort of revolutions that we saw in Russia and in China and various parts of the global south, where you have a revolutionary top-down authoritarian revolution, and we sort of know all the horrors that brings, right? But we've also seen in the last 30 to 40 years what you might call neoliberal revolutions, i.e. the colour revolutions in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. Now, these revolutions, as we know, have been opposed to authoritarian regimes that have been very nasty. However, they've all failed in varying extents, as we're aware, because they've been revolutions that instituted the neoliberal global order. And that's been manifested through the introduction of parliamentary representational democracy. Now, as we should all know, parliamentary representational democracy in a neoliberal global regime simply replicates the interests of the global economic capitalist class. And that creates corruption, and it creates co-option and alienation. And one of the main reasons, of course, for the rise of right-wing populist movements has been the inability of governments to look after people in this sort of global regime that's undercut people's culture and economic security. So the massive big move here in the 21st century is to completely move away in a structural sense from those two revolutionary models, because both of them have catastrophically failed. What we need to have in the 21st century is a reinvention of what radical democracy always meant, going back to ancient Athens. And that's the creation of assemblies of ordinary people who are selected randomly from the population. And the big advantage of this is that it destroys the ability of powerful groups to control who makes decisions, because who gets in the assembly is decided by chance. But potentially more importantly, the optics of this sort of revolution are truly revolutionary, in the sense that a bus driver from Warsaw or a farmer from Krakow will be seen to be making the decisions for the first time in Polish history, or in the first time in the history of any state. That's a true revolution. And it has two impacts. What it does is it brings people together. If people deliberate freely, they move in a progressive direction, a common sense direction. In other words, you can create the radicalism of a left revolution without the imposition of a top-down authoritarian methods, okay? Because the radicalism comes up through deliberation, not down from a revolutionary elite. And at the same time, it protects the state from neoliberal co-option, because once you put people together, then they will resist the corruption of the neoliberal system, because they won't rely on it for their power. So what you see over and over again on the prototypical citizen assemblies that have happened is that solutions and proposals come forward which are in direct conflict with the neoliberal regime. You've seen that in France with the demand, for instance, for a completely different economic system. So this is like a genius discovery or rediscovery of what 20th century revolution needs to look like, which is revolutionary, but also deliberative and progressive. And that's obviously what we're looking at. Okay, so I'm going to go over two final sort of broad themes, which I think, you know, are overarching ideas about how this is going to be achieved. So the first one is about the critical role of leadership in revolutionary movements. So one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest difficulties, particularly in the Western world, with constructing a genuine revolutionary movement, which is sustainable and actually can take control of the state, is the dogma of horizontalism. Now, horizontalism, if you're not aware of that idea, is that there can be no leaders and everything has to be decided by everyone. And the classic example of this is the Occupy movement in the early 2000s. Now, as a sociological observer of this, this creates two phenomena. The first phenomena is massive, rapid growth. The great advantage of horizontalism is there's no gatekeepers, so everyone can just get on with it. And that's why Occupy, for instance, spread around the world in a matter of weeks. So far, so good. However, the paradox of horizontalism, as you might say, is the very thing that leads to its result, to its success, is the very thing that destroys it. In other words, once you create a mass mobilization, if there's no structure, then it degenerates and collapses as rapidly as it grows. In other words, it's no solution to what it sets out to solve, which is the old authoritarian leftist sort of orientation. So what we've got to reinvent, as it were, or discover is a middle way between that old left authoritarianism and the disastrous inability of mass movements to take control of the state, which is absolutely necessary at this point in history. So what we need to return to, in my view, is what you might call the social democratic leadership structures that were used by Martin Luther King and by the Congress Party and Gandhi in the 1930s. And what that means is limited, accountable, and elected leaderships. And those leaderships then have autonomy to make decisions on behalf of the movement so that rapid decisions can be made in order to take control of the state or bring the state into negotiation. This is not utopian, okay, but it's functional. Nothing really that I'm saying in this talk is utopian, right? It's all stuff that can and should happen. But there's another element to leadership, which I think is absolutely essential in order to overcome a political regime. And that's the ability to escalate and to tactically maneuver. One of the biggest problems with horizontalism is it's tactically stupid. It's not able to make good general-esque decisions in the sense of, we're not going to go to the streets today, we're going to go tomorrow. We're going to go to that part of the city today, but not tomorrow. We're going to go to that city, but not that city. In other words, revolutions need generals. They need to have people who can direct the point to the opponent's weakest point. You saw this in Gandhi, you saw this in Martin Luther King, you saw it in the Iranian Revolution. All revolutions basically have a leadership structure that tactically maneuvers the forces. I mean, what you should be aware of is in classical civil disobedience, in classical non-violence, the idea is you're engaging in a war, but it's a war without violence, but it's still a war. It has generals, it has forces, and it has campaigns. So that relates to the second point, which is leadership is critically necessary in order to take the massive risks which are necessary in order to overcome a regime. A regime is not overcome by a cautious revolutionary leadership, right? One of the biggest problems with mobilizations over the last 10, 20 years, and arguably this was the case with what happened in Belarus, was the reliance on a single tactic. So in Occupy, for instance, it was just occupying a particular space. In Belarus, it was a Saturday march. All successful revolutions, as far as I can see, engage in a plurality of non-violent tactics, which escalate. And the key mechanism of success is to create a provocation to the opponent, which leads to repression and then a backfiring effect. Now, there's nothing pleasant about this, and there's no pressure, as far as I'm concerned, that anyone should engage in what needs to be engaged with. However, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves that overcoming a political regime requires high risk, high return strategies. An example of this, for instance, was the decision by a very small group of people in April 2019 to take control of 5 separate sites in London, right? That was a mad decision. It was a high risk decision because the police very easily could have stopped us getting to the sites, and then the whole thing would have failed. But we took the high risk because we wanted the high return of becoming a global mass civil disobedience event, which spread around the world and inspired people, right? But that was basically made by 5 people in a room. So this is what you have to do. You have to delegate tactical authority to a small number of people. Okay, so that's difficult, right? But that seems to be the way it is, right? If you could have great big gatherings of people, that'd be great, but it doesn't seem to be working. So I'm going to leave you on a more general point about the philosophy of revolution in the 21st century. And this is a more general point. I think one of the disasters of radical politics and all politics over the last 200 years has been the regression into what you might call othering. Othering is defined as deciding that other people are dehumanized and therefore you can perpetuate violence and death upon them. And this is like a massive problem in revolutionary movements. It sort of originates in a sort of Calvinist, black and white, reductive idea of good and bad. And it's been a disaster in revolutionary movements for decades and centuries, because what it does is it leads to authoritarianism and, you know, the decision basically to destroy other people's lives and livelihoods. And that may have been a problem in the past, but at the present moment in the 21st century, the fundamental thing we have to understand is we can't get this wrong again. We can't engage in a revolution that engages in that sort of mass violence, because if we do, then we're going to destroy the human race, because the human race is too powerful now to engage in mass violence. It will just destroy itself. So we have no alternative but to engage in a fundamental different philosophy of life, which reorientates ourselves to more traditional notions. In other words, what I'm trying to emphasize last of all here is I'm not being utopian or idealist. I'm being ruthlessly realist that we have to engage in reorientating our philosophy and rediscover the fraternity that was the third element in the French Revolution. In other words, there's equality and liberty, but there's always also fraternity, which is basically the love of each other as human beings. Love defined as the desire for the well-being of the other person. And this needs to be rooted in 2 fundamental spiritual realizations. By spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious, though it could be religious, but I mean more in a sense of what it is to be human, arguably in the existentialist sense of the European tradition. And the 2 realizations are that all human beings, all human individuals are fundamentally connected. In a fundamental sense, we're one organism. If we destroy part of ourselves, we destroy all of ourselves. And again, this is like something that's confirmed by modern science, as well as all our spiritual traditions. The second fundamental realization is that we are not separate from nature. We are nature. You know, we have bodies and they get infected by COVID. We are bodies. We're not just minds. And we can't maintain that Descartes-esque separation between mind and matter. We have to understand nature is us. It's not separate from us. So that really is the fundamental backbone, I think, to this project and how that hits the ground is the idea that when you win, you forgive your enemies in the great Christian tradition. And again, this is not due to some high-mindedness. It's due to a realist necessity that in this century, the human race is either going to come together or it's going to destroy itself. We have that fundamental decision to make. So that's really the job. So I just want to finish off by saying, I think everyone, just about everyone anyway, listening to this today will have this realization of the enormous gravity and severity of the crisis we face. In other words, that we can't afford to get this wrong, and that we have to step up into resistance in order to get it right. And I want to leave you then with a quote from probably the most famous European, maybe of the last century, Einstein, the physicist, and I'll leave you with his quote. So he said, "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act." That's us. Thank you.